Here we go. We are recording.
We are, yeah. Hello.
Hello. I don't know who should introduce themselves first, depending on where it goes. Why don't you start?
Yeah.
Why don't you begin?
Okay. So my name is John. I am a cybersecurity professional. I work in
Oh,
offensive cybersecurity. I spent 10 years in the Canadian Army where I was doing sort of signals intelligence cyber warfare stuff. I've left the Army and now I work in the private sector. And one of the reasons that I'm here is because I do an enormous amount of research on autistic Christians and ex-Christians, and your community has come up an enormous amount in my researching journeys, and so I just wanted to talk to you and
oh,
have an opportunity.
you pitched well. You hooked me. Say more about
Yeah.
what you just said.
Yeah, so I basically started a research project into autism and Christianity back in 2014 when I was raised as a conservative evangelical. I mean, I say conservative evangelical. It's Mennonite Brethren, but most people don't know what Mennonite Brethren means. So I just tell them conservative evangelical because it's close enough. The joke MB stands for mostly Baptists. So we were in the mostly Baptist camp. I obviously wasn't a particularly good Mennonite because I joined the army when I was age 18. And so, you know, I guess the Mennonite stuff didn't hold, but the conservative evangelical stuff definitely did. But then I
Wow.
left. But then I deconstructed and I left the faith when I was 19. And I found a whole bunch of other autistic people while I was at university at the Royal Military College of Canada. It's really close to Queen's University. And so there was a meetup for autistic people at Queen's, and I showed up and I started talking to a lot of them, and I started realizing, wow, we all have almost identical deconversion stories. This is really weird. And I thought, is this a trend? Like, is this an autism thing? Or is this something else? Or have I just stumbled upon a weird sequence of people that like, is this just a weird coincidence? So I started looking up the research online, and I found that the research generally pointed to autistic people being less likely to be Christian. And the reasons they gave I found were deeply unsatisfying, and I just intuitively didn't think they were correct. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll do this myself. So I basically started. So I'm a computer engineer, very good at building bots to scrape web applications, very good at doing data analysis, data processing, very good at sort of data analysis and all the things that come with it, and using computers to do that on a mass scale. And so I started doing that and just basically finding any autistic people on the internet posting about either Christianity or leaving Christianity and compiling all their things they were saying. And I've been doing that for basically 10 years over a long stretch of time. And about 2 years into that data collection, I realized I wasn't getting, you can only get so much information from just reading a person's posts,
Yeah.
right? like
Yeah.
like that. From passive data collect, you can only get so much, and you can't get deep into it, right? So you get a mile wide and inch deep, and I wanted to get a lot deeper and just figure things out. So I just started cold emailing or messaging these people that I was identifying, saying, hey, I'm an independent autism researcher. I'm looking into autism and Christianity. Do you want to do a long form interview with me? And then some of the times they would say yes, some of the times they would say no, but then I'd just do a long form interview. And so at this point, I have identified 26,000, more than 26,000 autistic Christians and ex Christians across the internet. And I've done long form interviews with over 500, and had conversations, like not recorded formal interviews, conversations. I don't know how many I've had, like probably over 800 at this point with different autistics. And so my whole project is figuring this out. So figuring out why it is that the numbers appear that autistic people are less likely to participate in Christianity, at least in the English speaking West. And then two, now that I figured that out, um, how do autistic Christians actually practice their faith? And I can't remember exactly what year you and your community came onto my radar. either late 2010s or early 2020s when I started seeing a lot of young men start to organize and gravitate around Jordan Peterson, and then the other people around Jordan Peterson, like John Vervaeke, and you know, I'm, I'm sure
Jonathan
you know
Peugeot.
exactly
Yep,
who.
yep,
Yeah,
yep, yep.
yeah, all those guys. And then your community started popping up, and started. I'm always looking for good data to mine, good sources to find.
My
People
community gives
having,
data.
yeah,
We give it
yeah,
freely.
yeah,
You
yeah.
want to watch? You want to watch YouTube content? TLC will provide.
Yeah, exactly. And so just like long form conversations, people I suspect are autistic, people who I don't know are autistic, seeing just, okay, what are they saying, and how are they saying it, and how are they interacting with these things. And so that's basically why I wanted to talk to you, because I thought, this is interesting, because I see a lot of autistic people go into your space and then leave your space, and some stay, and it's yeah, there are a lot of interesting dynamics there. And I thought, especially, I think your community would probably be interested in a lot of my
Yes.
research as well. uh
Well, so I have family, not in my immediate family, but my extended family. I have young adults on the spectrum. And what's interesting is that when I came to Sacramento, there was a little boy in the church who was severely autistic. Doesn't speak. He lives in a
yep.
group home. And so that then became sort of my definition of autism. But then there's this whole community of people who they hold a job and carry on a conversation and then will self-identify as autistic or on the spectrum or
Yeah,
so with your research, how on earth did you because there is a spectrum
there certainly is,
and
yes.
the more I learn about this, the more I had a really conversation with a woman at ARC who identified as autistic, and I believe her. And she was talking about the fact that, well, this actually presents quite differently in women than in
It
men,
does, yeah.
and
And
it presents so differently in different individuals. So it was like, so just in terms of your process, what you have to have some kind of working you have to have a way of at least isolating this group of people that you're focusing on. Talk to me about that
yeah,
first of all.
yeah, sure. So before we get that, it's probably better to give like a definition of what autism is, just because it's such a broad
Yeah.
category, and to just explain that my research is scoped purely to autism 1. I do a bit of autism 2, and so when before autism was autism spectrum disorder, autism was 4 or 5 things. So it was Asperger syndrome, it was PDD-NOS, it was high functioning autism, it was classic autism, and low functioning autism. And that was for DSM-4. When DSM-5 came out, they took all those different categorizations and put them all under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And so I'm diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. I was diagnosed when I was 16. It was informally diagnosed, so a professional diagnosed me, but I was raised in rural Saskatchewan, and rural Saskatchewan, there aren't really many supports for autistic people, just to put it mildly.
Yeah, yeah.
And obviously, I'm like, I can talk to people, I can hold conversations, and many of the things that I would need support for, I didn't really need any external support for. And I really wanted to join the army. It was all I wanted to do. I wanted to be an army officer. And the person assessing me said, I think you'll be a great army officer. I think this is what you should do. And I think you'll be very talented at this. But if you have a diagnosis line that says Asperger's on your medical record, that could prevent a like intake officer at the recruiting office from rejecting your profile, because they don't understand what they're looking at, and like
Right,
they'll look up Asperger's and they'll look up
right.
the criteria and they won't understand it's you, right?
Right.
They'll look at a diagnostic line and they'll reject you. And so they said, you have Asperger's. You are one of the most typical cases of Asperger's that I've seen in my life. Um, but I'm not going to put it on paper. Just go. The best thing for you is just to know you have it, so that you can understand yourself and understand other people's reactions to you, and then just go forward doing that. And so we had other terms like high functioning autism. And high functioning autism, the only real difference between high functioning autism and Asperger's was that it measured how fast, like how quickly you acquired speech as a child.
Hmm.
And so people with Asperger's don't have acquired speech delays. People with high functioning autism have acquired speech delays where they're typically don't acquire speech until like age 5 or 6. And that was the only difference. So once you turn 12, there are functionally no differences between people with Asperger's and high functioning autism. And then there was PDD-NOS, which is pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified, which is basically a term meaning we want to diagnose you with Asperger's, but you're like just on the edge and we can't get enough of the criteria. And that was essentially what it turned into. And so those three terms essentially describe the same thing, but just in differences in childhood. And once you become an adult, like how you were acting when you were 5
Doesn't
doesn't
matter.
really, like, there's no point in making that differentiation.
Yep.
So all of those got clumped together and put under autism 1. And so now we have three types of autism. You have autism 1, autism 2, and autism 3. Autism 1 is like the high functioning, or what used to be called high functioning. It's now called low support needs, meaning you don't need people to intervene in your life
Right.
so that you can live and function. And then uh, autism 2 is high support needs, which means you need someone to help you, you need someone to care for you. You will probably struggle with a lot of things in life and will need external support and like live in a group home and things like that. And then autism 3 is substantial support needs, where that's what we typically, like when people think autism, they usually think autism 3, which is what you described, that
Yep.
that boy in your church would probably be autism 3.
Yep.
And so my research is exclusively focused on autism 1, mostly because I'm just using the internet, right? So I'm an independent researcher. I don't work with a university. I don't have any organization that I go through. I have the internet and a computer to connect to it. And so when you look at the people who are on the internet and interacting with the internet who are autistic, while there are some autistic people in the autism 2 category, the crushing majority are going to be autism 1. You'll find the parents of people with autism 2 and autism 3 also on the internet, but um, those people provide interesting data, but they don't provide the data that I'm looking for, which is particularly how autism 1 interacts with Christianity. And and so yeah, the way I go about finding them is a little complicated and gets quite technical. So I worked in previous life, like I said, was an intelligence officer, and well, it wasn't intelligence;
Do
it's
you know who
signals intelligence.
Do you know Grim Grizz?
No.
Okay, you will soon. Keep going. To have someone I'm talking to actually self-identify I was an intelligence officer. This is gonna really draw some interesting. Keep going. Pay no
Yeah,
attention. You'll learn about it soon enough.
sure. Yeah, so like, you are around all these things, you learn how to like use various open source intelligence tools to find people on the internet saying things and doing things. So one of the one of the open source platforms that most people use for open source intelligence is called Multigo. And so I use Multigo, which just basically aids in web scraping, and I have a whole bunch of custom Python plugins that I use. and I basically look through social media and scrape it and look for people who are saying either I'm autistic, or in their bio they have autism in their bio, or they are in places where autistic people tend to congregate and tend to discuss.
Such
And
as
yeah, such as
Dungeons and
your
Dragons.
your sphere, yeah, or your sphere is one. Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons train, model train forums, things like that.
All
Those
the
are
fun stuff.
like, yeah, yeah, and so places like that, a lot of theology debate places,
Oh, yeah. Total
yeah, and
nerddom.
yeah,
Yeah.
and basically wherever nerds are, you just kind of troll those places looking for people. And then once you collect enough data, you start to be able to build models and use those models to predict how other people who aren't self-identifying will behave based on the model of people that you know are autistic. And then you
Interesting.
build that model, and then you use that model to make predictions, and then you use that model to weigh and test against other people to say, probabilistically speaking, if this person shows all these traits, what are the chances that they are autistic versus not autistic based on their posting habits? And while these things are not perfect by any means, they allow you to at least filter and sieve, and then once you've filtered, you can then start manually identifying. And so it's a complicated process of a lot of automation and a lot of then manual review of the automation after the fact. And yeah, that's the short answer of how you identify people on the web who have autism.
All right.
uh yeah, like there are a lot of autism researchers who do similar things, but uh they tend to, I think, make methodological errors when they're doing that, because they will only look for people who openly identify as autistic in their bio, or use like
Oh,
hashtags like actually autistic. And as I'm sure you know, people who are more conservatively aligned, or people who are not in progressive activist spaces, tend not to openly identify as autistic in their social media bios. They
right.
tend not to
Doesn't
use
give them
that.
any status.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They're in fact, it's negative status in many
Right.
places to openly identify as autistic. And so you don't want to do that. And so one of the really big challenges of my research is figuring out how to penetrate these communities to find other people who are autistic or are likely autistic who aren't in progressive communities, because I find a lot of autism research tends to have a bias where, the types of people who self-identify for autism research tend to have a certain political skew, and then those people know other people who are in the same bubble, and you end up accidentally only sampling from that one bubble and not sampling from other bubbles as well. And so, like, I've done a lot of interesting research going through like the online LCMS presence, and finding out that actually a lot of those people either have an actual diagnosis of autism or strongly suspect that they're autistic. But if you were an online autism researcher and you didn't even know that you should penetrate the LCMS community, there'd be no way that you would find that data, right?
Yeah.
But that's one aspect of the data, or of my analysis, that I think is sort of unique from other people's, is that I've tried really, really hard to break the sort of autism activism bubble that most research goes in, and instead sort of break out and find autistic people even when they're saying things that perhaps wouldn't align with what many people would like them to say. So I have a much more complicated view of autism, I would say, than many autism advocates out there, because I see everything, right? Like, I'm on the 4chan forums. I'm like in all the dark places of the internet. I know a lot of autistic people who are hanging out there. And so my view of how we interact and how we interact with autism, and how that autism interacts with Christianity, is probably different from most other autism researchers that I know. And I've talked to quite a few of them about that, and They're like, oh yeah, that's I didn't consider that, and that definitely shows something
Yeah.
interesting.
So where do we begin with this? Because, as you're talking, it's just out and out and out and out because even just my limited understanding of autism, part of why, I'm curious about this is because out of out of five nieces and nephews, three are on the spectrum in some way.
Yeah,
And it's like there must be some sort of genetic component
yeah, there
going
is.
on in that because that's an awful
Yeah,
big because I had five kids. One of my sisters had two kids, the other had three kids, and none of mine are on the spectrum to the best of our
yeah,
knowledge. But to have three out of five was like, whoa,
yeah.
that's a big group. And they're not all in one family. They're between the two families. So,
Yeah, there so from like figuring out what causes autism, we have a pretty good idea just from looking at the data, and we know that there is an incredibly strong genetic link for it. So the best predictor of whether your child will be autistic is whether you or someone in your lineage had autism. So, for example, you look at my family on my dad's side. My dad's definitely autistic. He was never diagnosed, but like him and I are like identical copies of each other in terms of personality. Unfortunately, the only difference is I'm significantly more introverted than him,
hmm,
but that's he's definitely autistic. I have a little sister who's on the autism spectrum as well. And then we look out to my uncles and my cousins and my aunties on my dad's side. My dad had 13 siblings. So
wow.
we there a whole bunch of my cousins also have it. And it's very common. One of the things I ask when I interview people is, if they're autistic, do you suspect anyone else in your immediate family is
Yeah,
autistic? And it's almost always, I suspect my mom is, or I suspect my
yeah,
dad is, or I suspect both, or not my mom and my dad, but my uncle definitely is, or
yeah.
my aunt definitely is. And yeah, so one of the things that you sort of mentioned earlier that's worth noting here is autism tends to look very different in girls than it does in guys because just a whole host of reasons. One of the big reasons is just how you're taught to socialize, the expectations that are placed on you. And brains are interesting things, but brains aren't fixed states. They are changing machines that change to your environment and are affected by your environment, and then you affect your environment, and so you get a sort of cyclical feedback loop in cognitive development that starts affecting you from pretty much the moment you exit your mother. And so this has some pretty interesting effects where girls with autism are not like guys with autism. And so when you look at like the exploding rates of autism, lots of people are like, autism used to be 1 in 20,000 and now it's 1 in 60 or something like that. And the reality is autism has not spiked. Our ability to detect autism has significantly improved, and who we consider to be autistic has significantly improved. So in the early 2010s and or the early 2000s, we primarily thought that Asperger's was a male condition that affected mostly men, and it was like the ratio was something like 1 in 10 or 1 in 4, depending on what time you sampled it. And then we just realized that it wasn't actually that the autism rate in girls was 1 in 4. It's just that 1 in 4 girls with autism looked like boys with autism, right? And so it wasn't that only these girls were autistic. It's that these girls tended to exhibit signs very similar to boys, and the other three that didn't show signs that were very similar to boys ended up being very different and expressing very differently. And so, the classic idea of what autism is in boys, or at least Asperger's, what the diagnostic criteria was had a lot to do with persistent social deficits and hyperfixations on unusual things. So like, trains or cameras, or for me, it was the Bismarck, like the German battleship from the Second World
Really?
War.
Did you ever
Yeah.
play the Avalon Hill game with it?
No, no,
My friend and I, we played that game. We played that game a lot.
no.
It was a game about searching the Bismarck, and it was a cardboard
Mm,
board, and you had all these little squares, and oh, super nerdy.
I
We loved it.
I listened to my dad was a big classic country music fan, and so I listened to a lot of Johnny Horton and his song "Sink the Bismarck." That was like on repeat for me as a child, and and so yeah, so that's like your typical boy interests for Asperger's. They're usually very odd and atypical, but for girls, a lot of them are interested in animals or princesses or Disney animation, and that's considered a totally normal thing for children to be like
Sure,
really interested in.
sure.
And then there are also like the different ways that boys are taught to respond to people and the way girls are taught to respond to people. Girls are taught to be more demure, less confrontational, and they get negatively punished for being confrontational, whereas boys, they're just expected to be confrontational. And so males with Asperger's will not get that, and girls who are on the autism spectrum will get the sort of negative pushback that will form their socializing habits very differently than it will with boys.
Yeah.
And so once we realize that actually girls also have autism, probably at a similar rate, we still don't know the exact rate, but probably at the similar rate that boys get autism. It just so happens that girls and boys are different and get socialized differently. And we shouldn't expect girls to look like boys or to expect 28-year-old women to act like 12-year-old boys with autism, right? Like
Thank
that's
goodness. Yeah.
yeah, like it's just like when you say it out loud it sounds absurd, but for a very long time we were taking diagnostic criteria that was mostly calibrated at children and male children and saying these are the criteria, these are the signs that you must
Yeah.
exhibit. And now that we've sort of expanded the criteria to say, okay, actually, there are different characteristics in girls and boys, and they will show up differently, and different socializations and different expectations that are just going to be different between these two things, and we shouldn't expect them to look the same. And once we did that, the rate goes from 1 in 10, where it was 10 boys for every girl, or 4 boys for every girl, to now almost 1 to 1.
Hmm.
Like the rate is just going to jump up, right? If
Yeah.
you almost exclude an entire sex class from your data set, and then now you include them, that's going to jump the rate. And then also we've done much better at screening. So if you look at rates of autism increase and rates of funding for autism screening in like a heat map, it's like they might as well be the same chart, where if you're looking for it and if you're screening for it and if you're actively trying to find it, the rate's just going to go up because you're looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
um yeah, and so that's kind of why the increase. But the main factor of are you going to be autistic is just, did you have autistic parents, or are there autistic people in your family? Because the genetic component to it is very strong.
Hmm.
In pretty much everyone I interview, they can identify family members who are either confirmed on the autism spectrum or thought to be on the autism spectrum. And in fact, one really common thing that I found for adults over the age of 35 is they don't realize they're autistic until they take their children in to get assessed, and then they bring their children in for the assessment, and they go, what's the cause of this? And the assessor is saying, the call's coming from inside the house, man. Like the cause of it is sitting in that chair over there, because you are probably also autistic. And so
Yeah.
a lot of older parents over the age of 35 are getting diagnosed with autism because their children are getting diagnosed now. and they just weren't screened for. No one was looking for it back in the 90s and 80s. And so now that it's the time,
Yeah.
um, that we're actually looking for it, they kind of go back retrospectively and say, "Were you like this? Is this an issue?"
Yeah.
And a very
Yeah.
very common thing that you'll hear from people is, "Oh, that's not autism. I was exactly like that when I was a kid." And it's like, yeah, and I mean one of the reasons that autism often would go undetected in children is that they would say, "This isn't abnormal. This is just exactly like one of our kids, or like what we were like when we were kids."
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of causes of autism is almost solely genetic.
Well, and to make your quest here even more difficult, so on one hand, you have all of the complexity around autism. On the other
Yeah,
hand, you have all of the complexity around this thing. In fact, I just bought Peter Leithart's book. Um, we use this word Christianity, but is Christianity a thing? Is it, I
yeah,
mean, and so then you've got this, which is sort of a budding frontier of discovery that we've been in terms of patterns of behavior and relationality and cognition, together with something that, in many ways, a good portion of the world has been wrestling with, just trying to get its head around for 2,000 years plus. So you
yeah,
sure you sure bit off something pretty large
yeah.
for your
And
so again it's hard to figure out where to begin with this because and probably the best place to begin was your story because that's what prompted the discovery because
yeah,
you grew up in a church, it has a particular form. I appreciate what you just talked about because a lot of what's happened in the last 50 years is that so much sort of conservative evangelicalism has sort of everything's just sort of coalesced into that blob of conservative
yeah,
evangelical. They might baptize or not baptize. There might be a few little particulars, and that doesn't mean that the traditional um, inherited things, the particularities of that tradition are unimportant, but they don't govern anywhere near as much as they governed in past centuries.
yeah,
So okay, so well, maybe yeah, take it from
yeah.
there.
So just to sort of answer your question about the complexity of Christianity, for my research, I don't even like consider Christianity really to be a thing.
Yeah,
I think there are Christianities,
yeah,
like there, because so I'm really interested in the sociology of religion, and that's it has been my autistic focus since I was like 19. Like when I started to deconstruct, I got really interested in, well, what is this religion thing anyway? Like, how does it function? Why does it function? Why do people like it? Because I found all those things very hard to understand. And like when you look at it and you compare like a Coptic Orthodox to a, I don't know, Bethel charismatic, and you look for the overlap between them,
yes,
how much really is there? Not a whole lot.
yes,
And so for my research purposes, I sort of treat them like they're their own separate buckets. They're all technically under one branch, but I've decided to cut the buckets off at like Nicene Christianity, so I don't really research Mormons. I've talked to a lot of Mormons as sort of controls to see, okay, are there any differences that pop up here? And I've sort of just scoped it to English speaking Christians because that's just easier for me to do because I basically only speak English, and I used to speak French, so I do have some French speakers in there. But yeah, so for me, I yeah I like I said was raised conservative evangelical, and as soon as I went to university, found a conservative evangelical church. And then when I sort of got into it, I started, like many autistic people, to wildly misunderstand what was going on in church. um, and to completely
oh,
miss the point of what people were doing.
Oh,
One of the things I found in my research is that autistic people, their methods and modes for interacting with Christianity are very heavily skewed to intellectualization and thinking about things and analyzing things, systematizing, breaking everything down into small components, figuring things out, asking questions, and very quickly realized that most people do not go to church for that.
they
you
do
know, I
not.
my dad is on the autism spectrum. I suspect my mom might be, but it's always difficult to tell with women. But my mother has a PhD in virology. My dad is an engineer. Like they are both very intelligent, very smart people. And so for me, intellectual engagement with Christianity was never something I really struggled with because both of my parents were very intellectual and very engaged. But I started going to Bible studies and small groups and just listening to sermons and then starting to have questions that I never really had before and getting into arguments with people a lot and started to have questions that people didn't really have great answers to. Like I went from being a young earth creationist to all of a sudden realizing, ooh, there are some good points being made here about the whole evolution thing, and good points that I'm not seeing great answers to. That is causing me issues. And so then I would talk about it in the small group, but then the small group would hear me talking about it and think that intellectual processing that I was doing was like an explicit attack against them, which
Yep.
sort of negatively polarized me even more to look into it deeper.
Yep.
Because instead of getting answers, I got like people angry at me. And instead of
Yes.
going, we should synthesize these things, when I said, hey, I think there's a genuine issue with like young earth creationism because I don't think it can explain the DNA evidence that we have in the human genome or many other genomes for that matter. And I think this is an actual problem. And I'm seeing all these issues. And instead, it was sort of treated with hostility. And then I eventually found some Christians who were talking about how evolution is completely coherent and can be squared with Christianity. Here's how you do it. And I thought, whew, great. I can actually do this. Maybe I'll just be a weird Christian for a bit. And then I started realizing, oh, if I was wrong about this, what else could I have been wrong about? And yeah, autistic people get really hyper focused on things. And I thought, I'm going to figure this out. This is going to be my thing. And so then I started reading Bible scholarship. I started just getting right into debates about various topics in the New Testament, particularly. I found a lecture on YouTube by Bart Ehrman about misquoting Jesus. And I thought, I didn't know any of this stuff. This is crazy. What do you mean? And started reading a lot of sort of popular scholarship and then quickly moved on from popular scholarship and apologetics to actual scholarship and just started devouring that all while doing a computer engineering degree. And then, sort of, as I got more into scholarship, I started realizing that the version of Christianity that I had been participating in was perhaps not capturing all the sufficient complexities and nuances that a lot of the scholarship was having. And I just became convinced that Christianity wasn't true. Like, it just said things that were factually incorrect. And it took a very long time for me to come back to Christianity because of all of that stuff. And I eventually ended up coming back. I ended up coming back through a very circuitous route. And basically, when I left the military, I ended up earnestly coming back to Christianity. I had been attending an Anglican church mostly because I just liked liturgy and was interested in religion, but wasn't actually practicing in any real sense. And I earnestly came back when I left the military in 2020, like right as the pandemic started. I left the military and then I just started thinking. I had a whole bunch of time doing forensics and penetration testing in my room by myself during the pandemic. Had a lot of time by myself with my thoughts, and I ended up coming back to Christianity and reconverting, and now I'm earnestly in the Anglican Church. But yeah, that's sort of the trajectory that I went on. And once I came back to Christianity, I thought I have so much data and so much interesting things that I can share with people. I was never really planning on publishing any of my research. I was doing research for the sake of my own interest,
Yep.
just because I found collecting sociological data and then analyzing it a very interesting thing to do. I felt I was coming to novel conclusions. I was finding things out that people hadn't figured out, and I was diving deep into all these things and learning things and creating models and stuff like that.
Yep.
And then now that I came back to Christianity, I was like, oh, I'm sure other people would find this research helpful, and find my various findings helpful. You know, just
Yeah.
looking at why do people actually deconvert? Like,
Yeah.
what causes people to leave Christianity? And especially what causes autistic people to leave Christianity. Why do we leave at such a high rate
Yeah.
when compared to non-autistic people? And then for the ones who figured out how to make Christianity work for them, what did they do?
Yep.
You know, what sorts of things? And so I initially started writing a book, and that didn't go well. I got to the end of the book and I thought I need to rewrite this whole thing. Like my thinking just from writing it down, my thinking evolved so much from when I began that
Yep.
I had to redo the book. So I did that 3 times. And by the end of the time I got to my third draft, I thought the perfectionist in me is never going to let me publish a book. But I thought I can publish a podcast. I will be able to do that because it's more of, it's conversational.
Yes.
It's there is less pressure to say everything right because you're
Yes.
having a conversation with someone. You are sort of thinking out loud and expressing your thoughts out loud. And I just found that medium was a lot easier to explain my research. So I created a podcast called Christianity on the Spectrum, where I basically just explain all my research. So I created 10 episodes to sort of systematically lay out the two main research questions I have. Why are autistic people less likely to be Christian? And then two, okay, what does Christianity look like for autistic people who have figured it out?
Hmm.
And then after that, I just got bombarded with questions while I was
Yeah.
dropping the podcast. And so now I've just been slowly working through the questions, putting out Q&A episodes where
Oh.
I try to answer people's questions. And so, especially these days, I got a lot of questions about gender and sexuality as it relates to
Yeah.
autism, because
Yeah.
autistic people are like disproportionately trans,
Yep.
disproportionately LGBTQ
Yep.
or A, and people wanted to know why, and I have lots of data on that. So I was like, sure,
Wow.
sure, I'll do 4 episodes on autistic people and their relation to gender and sexuality. So did that, and basically whenever people throw questions at me, I'll put all my research together, create an episode, and send it out into the world for anyone to listen to. Yeah, that's basically my story as condensed as I can. If
Wow.
if you if you want to hear the full one, I did create 3 full podcast episodes explaining like the exact reasons I deconverted and how I deconverted,
Yeah.
and then why I came back to Christianity. Like I was a huge Sam Harris fan. I was like big into the new atheists, and I'm no longer that. I'm now a practicing Christian in an Anglo Catholic church. So yeah.
Huh. Very interesting. The this isn't a picture of you. If I when I pulled it up on
No,
Bing.
no, that's a picture of Simone Weil.
No, it's
Um,
not Simone Weil either. It's someone else.
oh, oh,
All right. And your podcast is oh
Christianity on the Spectrum.
no, it's on Podbean too. Good. Good. That's where I post my stuff. So
Yeah.
oh. All right. So what do you want to do? Do you want to give me a few points? Do you want to ask some questions? Do you want to what do you want to do with this?
Yeah, I mean, I was down for whatever, but I think like one of the things that I want to try to communicate to people is just one thing I do that I find Christians often get wrong is misunderstanding deconstruction and why it happens, and like why do autistic people actually leave Christianity. And I think that
And
is,
defining what that means because
yeah. So when I say deconstruction, I mean deconversion.
They
I
they
mean, like,
they stop going to church. They stop identifying as Christians.
yeah.
They stop certain Christian practices because those are sort of three things that you
Yeah.
can sort of point to
So
easily.
I would say all three of them combined. Basically,
Yes.
they just fully opt out. That's what I would call deconstruction,
Yeah.
when they pull themselves out of that. And
even
so,
even if their formation, probably within a Christian family and a Christian church, even
yeah,
though their formation is deeply Christian, and which means that so many of the impulses and their moral imaginary, all of these things are deeply formed by Christianity, even
yep,
if they don't necessarily practice classic Christian behaviors, they don't identify as Christian, they don't participate in specifically Christian practices, something like that.
yeah, yeah. And so, like, I don't think anyone fully extricates themselves from Christianity. If you're living in the West, you are, whether willingly or not, embedded in the mesh of Christianity. And for better or worse, I think there are some good things that come about, and some probably not so good things that come about from that as well. But yeah, so this was a question I looked at a lot, because just figuring out why is fairly hard. So there was one big paper that came out that got referenced a lot when I started looking into this. It was called "Do Mentalizing Deficits Constrain a Belief in a Personal God?" And the idea,
Hey, I got to write that one down here. Do
yeah,
mentalizing deficits constrain a belief in a personal God?
yes. So it was a research paper that looked at autistic people and non-autistic people, and then controlled for theory of mind, or supposedly controlled for theory of mind. They looked for, and theory of mind is your ability to intuitively understand another person's emotional state.
Right.
And the idea is that autistic people are worse at that than their non-autistic counterparts. And the thinking of the people in the paper is that if autistic people are worse at this, the reason we're less likely to be Christian is because we're less likely to be good at, like, conceptualizing God as an independent mind from ourselves that has feelings and thoughts and things towards us.
Right.
So
Right.
maybe that's the reason that people are less likely to be Christian. But I read that and I thought that doesn't seem intuitively right to me. Like, that
Mhm.
was never a problem with Christianity for me. My problems were the doctrinal aspects, they were the social aspects, they were the relational aspects, and like the way things were communicated to me. And especially looking back at it, I think like a really big issue is just no one knew how to talk to me. No one knew how to communicate things to me in a way I would understand. And what I got was a form of Christianity, right? Not Christianity, a specific form of Christianity that was mostly designed for people who don't think like me, who don't like process like me, who aren't interested in thinking about things that the way I'm interested in thinking of. And I thought, I think that probably has more to do with it. But again, at the time I couldn't prove it. And so what I did is I just found a lot of ex-Christian autistics, and I asked them, "Hey, why'd you leave?" And they gave me a lot of answers. And so I very varied, right? Like all over the place, all over the map. And I was thinking, well, how do I actually properly conceptualize this? And so what I started to realize is one common thread running through all these different testimonies and all these different anecdotes that I was collecting is mental strain and mental pressure. And I started to realize what they're describing, whether they know it or not, is cognitive dissonance,
Yep.
right? They are describing they got overwhelmed by cognitive dissonance
Yep. Yep.
and they left.
Yep. And that, in
And
my
that's
opinion,
basic.
that's super common in terms of why people leave.
Yep.
It's cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
Yep. And so then I thought, okay, but everyone gets cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is not an autism specific
Preachers
phenomenon.
provoke cognitive dissonance in sermons intentionally.
Yes. Yes, it is a normal thing that everyone experiences. So why is it happening with autistic people? And what I sort of found is that autistic people just at a baseline have significantly less capacity for cognitive dissonance. So if I call it the cognitive dissonance pressure cooker. So the model I use is think of a pressure cooker. The pressure vessel for autistic people is just smaller, so they can handle less cognitive dissonance.
Yep.
And then you look at, okay, what causes cognitive dissonance? And there are all sorts of causes of cognitive dissonance. But for autistic people, because of the way we think about things, because of the way we interact with people, because of the social challenges that come with autism, like a lot of us really struggle to understand other people's intentions, their thoughts. We miss social cues. We don't understand what people are trying to communicate to us. A lot of us deal with a lot of confusion and a lot of difficulty with that. We go, okay, so there's now, not only do we have a smaller pressure tank, but the things that cause cognitive dissonance, there's just more opportunities for autistic people.
Absolutely.
And then I looked at another factor, which is, well, what happens when cognitive dissonance gets caused? Like, how much does something increase pressure in the pressure tank? And I started looking at autistic people and then comparing them to other ex-Christian communities that weren't autistic. And I joined a lot of ex-Christian like Facebook pages and subreddits and heard a lot of testimonies, read a lot, and I started to realize the things that cause autistic people cognitive dissonance cause us way more than it does the average person. And so when you look
Yeah.
at something like contradictions in the Bible,
Yeah.
that causes autistic people significant amounts of cognitive dissonance, and just
Yeah.
like small things, right? Because we're very detail oriented. We care about the little details. It's very hard for us to let those things go. And we obsess about them in ways that most people don't. And so, a really common example that I hear cited, and one that I think is interesting, is when you look at the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. They're different lists of names, right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
this
Yep. Yep.
uncontroversial.
Yep.
You put the two lists together,
Yep.
at some point they diverge.
Yep.
And they both say they're coming from Joseph, right? And you really have four options with that, right? So you think either both of them are somehow correct, one of them's correct and the other's not. You know, Matthew's right, Luke's not. Luke is right, Matthew's not, or neither of them are correct.
Mm.
And you think, how do I solve this problem? How
Mm.
do I prove which one is correct? And you can't, right? There's no way to prove it. And especially with like a hyper systematizer mind, like a hard empiricist, hard left brain, I need to figure this out. I need to drill down into this and solve this problem. When you can't solve the problem, what's that going to do to you?
Right.
Versus someone who can adopt a more live and let live model,
Yep.
or
Yep.
a maybe there's an answer out there but I don't understand it yet. Usually not satisfying for autistic people. And so like the things that cause us cognitive dissonance cause us a lot more than most people. And then there, like, a really big thing with autistic people is a lot of us get really mad and really frustrated at hypocrisy and dishonesty and things like that. And it's,
Yeah.
if you know autistic people, you'll know like a lot of us freak out about that stuff. Like, I, you know, I got a lot of nicknames growing up around the fact that I would constantly freak out around these sorts of things, because I mean I didn't like it and I hated it. And within Christianity, there are lots of opportunities to feel that way, right? And there are lots of things that will cause you to feel that way. And so just you have smaller pressure tank. More things cause pressure. The things that cause pressure cause more pressure. And then you think, okay, well, surely there's a release valve for this, right? Surely somewhere on the pressure tank there needs to be a button that the church can press, or the people in the church can press, that will release steam and
Right.
lower the pressure.
Right.
And so you look at this and like you look at all the techniques that the church has developed to alleviate cognitive dissonance. And then you look, how effective are these for autistic people? And they're significantly less effective. And
Yeah.
so, like the one very common thing that I found with autistic people is a lot of us really deeply struggle with the relational aspects of Christianity and the
Yeah.
relational language
Yep.
because we think about relationships so differently. It's a misconception that we don't form relationships or that we don't think relationally. That's not the case. We do. We just think of relationships in a completely different category than most people do. And so when you are adopting language about relationships that you find alien to you, you say, okay, I have all these issues with reading the Bible that I can't solve, but I have this personal relationship with Jesus that I know to be true. That helps to relieve your cognitive dissonance. But a lot of autistic people don't have that thing to grab onto. And so we turn often to apologetics, right? Apologetics is extreme. Like I just did an episode about the weird relationship between autistic people and apologetics. A lot of us have an apologetics phase where we get really into apologetics.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of us have like a Calvinist phase where we get
Yeah.
really into
Yeah. Yeah.
Calvinism if we're
Yeah.
Protestant.
Because
Um,
Calvinism can just shortcut a whole bunch of dissonance.
oh yeah,
It's got
yeah.
certain mechanisms to just bang. You just shortcut
This
that
is the
dissonance.
answer. This is the Bible verse. Solved.
Oh
you
yeah.
know so a lot of us get into Calvinism, a lot of us get into like being tradcats,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
most of us, though, regardless of the denomination, get really into apologetics and really into proving Christianity. And this ends up being a sort of double-edged sword because you quickly find out as you start getting more into it, the answers get less satisfying, and you start realizing, oh, there's actually genuine complexity here that I wasn't super prepared for. It's very, very common to hear autistic people talk about that they felt betrayed by apologetics
Oh,
because
oh, interesting.
they felt that these guys had the answers to me. And again, we're like hyper left brain, right? Like
A lot of
extreme
people in the
extreme
corner in that bucket.
systematizers. Yeah,
Yeah.
extreme systematizers,
Yeah.
extreme heavy analytical people, and we need to have like the right answer to resolve this. And like this was 100% me. I mean, still is to a large degree. And so when you don't have that right answer, that cognitive dissonance doesn't go away. In fact, it usually increases. And so for a lot of people, they listen to apologetics and they read evidence that demands a verdict or the case for Christ, and they go, whew, this is great. I'm justified in my belief. I'm not an idiot. A lot of autistic people encounter those texts and they go, oh no, this is our best defense. Oh, this is bad. and that causes even more things. And so the pressure release valve on the cognitive dissonance tank is less effective because the mechanisms that Christianity has built up and developed around relieving cognitive dissonance are not built to relieve autistic people's cognitive dissonance. They're meant to relieve non autistic people's cognitive dissonance, and they think very differently from us. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a different thing, right? You're dealing with, in many cases, apples and oranges. And while autistic people are still people and we respond to many of the same incentives that other people do, we have some unique cognitive styles and ways of thinking about things that lend to the techniques that most people find effective for alleviating that cognitive dissonance to just be significantly less effective. And eventually that pressure just builds up, right? It becomes too strong in that tank. And one of two things happen. Either it becomes too strong for too long, that you just say, I can't handle the mental load anymore, and you just pull yourself away from it. And when you pull yourself away from it, you start to feel the cognitive dissonance resolve, and you go back, and then it increases, and then you come out and it
Yep.
resolves, and you go
Yep.
back and you cycle in, and then you start thinking, why am I going back? Like, why am I subjecting myself to this?
Yep.
And so that's one option. But the more common one is usually some something knocks the tank over and it explodes,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it gets very messy very quick.
Yep.
everything goes everywhere,
Yep.
and it's like a rapid, unscheduled disassembly.
Yeah.
So that's what happened with me. It was a pretty rapid uh, disassembly, and again, I was very systematic in my Christian thinking. I had everything lined up, everything interconnected, everything works well, like this beautiful pocket watch where everything works, and then like a tiny grain of sand gets into it, the pocket watch breaks. It's like, okay, now what do I do? And then basically I couldn't deal with it anymore. Uh, and it just kind of exploded everywhere, and I left. And so when you're looking at why are autistic people less likely to be Christian, it's just like that's it basically. Right?
That makes
Like,
perfect sense. Makes perfect
yeah,
sense.
that's why people are less likely to be Christian. Like you hear a lot of apologists saying things like, "Oh, they just wanted to sin" or something like that. And like, I'm sure that's a factor for some people. It's definitely not a factor for the people I interview, right? The people that I interview are extremely conscientious.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
care a lot about morals. Even
Yeah.
when they
Yeah.
deconvert, they're still
Yeah.
heavily moral, heavily like
Yeah.
concerned with doing the wrong thing and the right
Yeah.
thing and making sure that they're
Yeah.
like, none of them that I've talked to were like, oh, well, just Christianity was stopping me from doing the thing I wanted to. It's never that, right? It's always, if this is true, I should follow it, and then things just start building up. Um, there were like a few really big inciting events of deconversion that I saw. One was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. That caused a lot of autistic people to go, wait, what's going on here? When you're raised in a conservative evangelical household, you're told this is what moral character is. This is what it looks like. This is what a good person is. And then they saw Donald Trump and they were like, okay,
Wait.
so we're definitely against that guy, right? And they go, no, we're not. And they go, whoa, okay. The Black Lives Matter protests were another big inciting thing that I saw just a lot of buzz and a lot of movement around
Huh.
with autistic people who were seeing Christian responses to it and going like, okay, well, I might agree with the like I might see nuance in here, but I definitely don't see like the really angry reactions people are having to this. And especially in America, where sort of Christianity gets closely tied with right-wing politics. And wherever right-wing politics goes, that's where Christianity goes. I mean, some forms of Christianity,
Yeah.
really. That caused a lot of cognitive dissonance over the years. And but like when you look at liberal or progressive Christianity, you might think, well, we'll find a lot more autistics in that space. And you don't. You don't.
No.
You
No.
you
No.
you tend not to find us in
No.
in super progressive spaces either,
No.
because they get there and they go, wait, what's the point? Why am I
Exactly.
doing this?
Yep.
There's got
Yep.
to be a reason for me to do this, right?
Yep.
And the reason you're giving me is symbolism and metaphors, and I don't really do symbolism and metaphors. Like that's not exactly the strongest forte of autistic people, I'll say, just to put it lightly. And so you don't see them there either, because they want to take Christianity seriously, and they get there and they go, oh, you guys don't actually mean this, and I want you to mean it. I also, like, I'm not a big fan of what's going on politically on this side, but theologically I'm not a big fan of what's going on this side either. And a lot of autistic people tend to be sort of all over the map politically. Like, many of us are progressives, many of us are conservatives, but I would say most of us are a weird mix of both that don't properly fit into any camp. And when you
Hmm.
look at autistic Christians tend to be overwhelmingly, though, theologically conservative. So even if they are like leftist communists, they will tend to be theologically conservative, where they will, literal resurrection, yes. Every line of the Nicene Creed, absolutely. Like, the importance of Scripture, absolutely high up there. And you just tend not to find a lot of us on the sort of liberal progressive side of things, even though a lot of us would more closely politically align with that, we tend to still stay on the theologically conservative side of things. So that's also an interesting thing, because when I first started doing this research, I wish I would have written them down just so I could see how horribly wrong I was when I started out my research. But I suspected that most autistic Christians that I would find would be liberal, and like theologically liberal, and socially progressive, and or theologically progressive, and in, like the sort of progressive side of the emergent church type of thing,
Yeah.
the sort of low hierarchy egalitarian side. And that's like not at all how it ended up working out. Like, I just found that most autistic Christians are a weird mix politically, and tend to be overwhelmingly theologically conservative. Like, it's in like the 80 plus percent
Yeah.
amount of us who stay practicing. It's not because many of us don't have a phase going through progressive Christianity. Many of us like do check it out. It's just most of us who check it out don't stay. We kind of
Yeah.
go, what's the point in staying here, and
Yeah.
and check out.
Well, so talk to me about the way I think you nicely laid out, and I can totally see it. I totally see it. The dissonance and I absolutely. What did the way back look like for you?
Yeah, so that's a long story, but I'll try to tell it shortly. So I was a really big Sam Harris fan. I was like in the Sam Harris side of the New Atheists. I like the heavy rationalist cognitive side of things, like the online rationalist spheres. I was super into those, very, very plugged into that side of the internet. Those were my people, and to a large extent still are my people. But as I started to do more work with the military, I started to see flaws in the way that Sam Harris did his analysis, right? I just started realizing he is saying things are one way, but the reality is actually way more complicated. Like, there is complexity and nuance to religion in these places that he doesn't see. And I slowly just started to become disillusioned with
Hmm.
him and his work, because I just didn't see it as concording to reality, or at least not being the best description of reality. Like, it wasn't that I thought he was saying false things. I thought he was saying things that I didn't think were accurate. And especially his characterizations of foreign policy and the effects things were having in foreign policy. Like, I was living that, and he was explaining it to be one way, and I'm like, no, dude, like, you don't get it. There are so many things that you don't have access to, that you can't see, that I can,
Hmm.
that I know you're wrong about this. And then I just started thinking, well, what if that applies not just to foreign policy? What if that applies to his other ways of thinking
The
and modes
same
of
thing that
analysis?
happened with your Christian community happens with
Exactly.
the Church of Sam Harris.
Exactly. And so that started, I became I became less enchanted with Sam Harris. And you know, I can't really talk about any of my military service,
Right.
mostly just because it's just
Right.
stuff you can't talk about. But I started to feel morally conflicted about things that were happening and the way things were happening. And that, I think that's about all I can say about it.
Okay.
The type of work that I was doing was very mentally strenuous, lots of pressure. I wasn't in combat or anything like that. Like, I'm not claiming PTSD or anything like that. I wasn't being shot at. I was always safe. But you when you're in this type of work, you sort of see things, hear things, start to understand things.
Yep.
You are involved in making moral decisions that affect people's lives. who lives, who dies, those types of things. And like, while I wasn't like pressing a button to kill anyone,
Right.
when you are a feeder
Yeah.
into the intelligence
Yeah.
networks that, whether the Navy SEALs are going to go knock on someone's door and say hello to a guy,
Yeah.
that I mean, I'm Canadian, so it wasn't the Navy SEAls, but I just assume most people won't
Well, we can,
know anything about CanSoftCom. Um,
it's quite well known, the Enigma machine. They, had broken the
yes,
German codes, but then they have to, as it's in the movie, they can't just use that all the time, and so they know. So yeah, there's complexity
yes.
in there, and
Imagine that scenario playing out like
there you go. We can use that.
over the course of many years. That has a mental strain on you, right? Like
Absolutely.
that it weighs heavily on your conscience. And
Yep.
I was always very concerned with ethics and morality,
Yep.
and there are never clear answers to these things, and they
Nope.
get very difficult to deal with, very difficult to navigate.
Yep.
And that's that. So I started to feel that. And one of the ways of coping with that is I started reading a British poet from the First World War. He was an infantry officer named Wilfrid Owen.
Hmm.
If you read First World War poetry at all, or if you went to school in England, you probably know him.
Hmm.
Um, he wrote a lot of extremely depressing and brutal poetry about the reality and the nature of the First World War.
Hmm.
And I found a lot of it really resonated with me. So I had a few of my friends commit suicide based on the
Oh.
types of work we were doing. A lot of us had like pretty intense substance abuse issues. Lots of things like that happen when you're dealing with this type of work. And he writes about that, right? Like he writes about that sort of desperation and mental anguish and things like that. And I found a lot of that relatable. And although I like wasn't on the front lines, I wasn't shooting people, I wasn't getting shot at. It's not the same as being in the trenches of World War One. I found a lot of the ways that he talked about war and the nature of war and warfare very resonant. But another thing is Wilfrid Owen is extremely Christian
Hmm.
when you read his work. So you read his work, there is no way you can come out with any conclusion other than the fact that this man is Christian and what he says is deeply informed by Christianity
Hmm.
and everything he does. And again, I really was really interested in Christianity. I spent all my time thinking about and researching Christianity, my free time, that is. I often call myself a Star Trek Christian, in the sense that I like Christianity in the same way other people like Star Trek. I like learning the lore, reading the wikis,
Oh,
and
wow.
like finding people to discuss my Star Trek interests with me. I don't think any of it's true, but I think it's really interesting.
Hmm.
And that was sort of the place I came to. But reading Wilfrid Owen, I started to realize maybe there is something going on here
Hmm.
in Christianity that allows Wilfrid Owen to say the things he's saying that I don't have in my arsenal because I'm not a Christian, right? Like I started to realize that this couldn't be said by Sam Harris. Not that like Sam Harris couldn't say these exact words, of course he could, but like Sam Harris would never think to write the poems that he did in the
Right.
way that he wrote them, and he wouldn't be able to have things resonate with me in the way that they currently do. And I thought, okay, well, I guess I admit there is something more to Christianity, working perhaps on a sociological level and on a different way of thinking about things that matters in a different way than just the brute facts of analysis.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm being coherent. Is
No,
is this making
I
sense?
understand completely.
Okay,
Very
one second.
clear.
I think my headphones just died.
Oh, oh. Talk, 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 talk. Can you hear me?
I'm just power cycling them to see if that fixes it.
Test, test, test. Test, test, test. Test.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. Yeah. So, am I being coherent?
Yes.
Does this sort
Yes.
of make sense? Okay, good.
Perfect sense.
Yeah, I'm always struggling to figure out whether or not people are understanding what I'm saying when I talk about this, because I think this is not systematic. This is not rigorous. You're losing people.
Well,
But
but again, back to I love how you described I loved how you described the particular pressures a young person starts going to church, they're in the faith, they look at this social milieu, they look at this system, and dissonance forms. There's dissonance of hypocrisy, there's dissonance of propositional factuality, there's different there's the I can completely understand that
yeah,
world is like, and then something happens and it's like, I'm out, I'm out.
yeah,
But I think for many people, they imagine that the church is like this little domed community, and when you leave the church, you're just out there in the fresh, clean air. But the
yeah,
truth is, there's no outside. You're always in some worldview, somehow, somewhere, and the particularities of living on the spectrum are going to intensify certain aspects. And at some point, as you grow older and grow up, and as you have more experiences, you're just going to have to learn to make your peace with certain things. It's
yeah,
because the world, we can look at John Vervaeke, a la combinatorial explosion. The world is just too big. No matter how smart you are, no matter how focused you are, the world is such a thing that you will never get to the bottom of everything. You might
yeah,
not, you might even decide you can't get to the bottom of anything, and then you're going to have to figure out how to live with that. And
yeah.
suddenly, yeah, I get it. I get it.
Yeah, so Wilfrid Owen didn't make me a Christian at all. What Wilfrid Owen did for me was sort of open a door that I had closed long ago,
Yep.
and
Yep.
and the door that he opened was maybe there's something to Christianity that I don't understand.
Yep.
Maybe there is something going on here that is good and useful that I have not accounted for.
Plausibility.
Yes. Well, it wasn't factual
No,
plausibility.
no.
It was like there's something. And
Well, you
then
could identify with him and
yeah,
the pain you're feeling. You could read the pain in him, and you knew, yeah, soldier
yeah,
in the First World War. How can he carry this pain? Well, clearly, Christianity is helping him carry this pain. There must be
yes,
some utility to this thing. Yeah, I get it.
yes. And that's basically and I thought he was speaking things that were true on an emotional level, right? Like I was like, okay, I and I started thinking, well, maybe I misjudged this to some degree. And then I just by chance was having an argument with a friend of mine about Jesus and the various miracle claims of Jesus, and I brought up Apollonius of Tyana, and I said, why should I accept the miracle claims of Jesus when you have other pagans who were claimed to do similar other things
Yep.
like Apollonius of Tyana? And he looked at me like I had just like triggered a trap, and he's like, have you read Rene Girard? And I said, no, I have not. And he said, you should read this book. It's very short. It's called I See Satan Falls Like Lightning. And it talks a lot about the differences between Christ and Apollonius of Tyana. And I think there would be some use for you in that.
Hmm.
And so I read I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, and I went, ooh, oh, I hadn't thought about this. And I started reading all of Girard and their
Wow.
CBC radio, like
Yeah.
the Canadian public broadcaster, did a really good 5-part series on the
Yep.
thought of Rene Girard called The
Yep.
Scapegoat.
Yep. It's
And
really good.
I listened to that and I just like remember sitting there. I listened to the whole thing in one day. And I just remember sitting there staring at a wall, being like, what did I just listen to? Like, what just happened there? And what happened was not that I became a Christian at all, is that Girard was able to frame Christianity in a way where I was like, okay, there's probably something like Wilfrid Owen opened the door of there's something going on, and like Girard kicked me through it. I think if the door had not been opened by Owen, I probably wouldn't have been kicked through the door.
Yep.
But Gerard basically kicked me through that door, and I ended up on the other side of things after a few months of reading him. I don't know if I would be considered a Gerardian. Um, I just read Gerard and thought, oh, this is different. This is a different way of thinking of Christianity that I had never thought about before, where you're not necessarily looking at Christianity as a set of propositional truth claims, which you either accept or defend, and or is accept or deny. And the goal of Christianity is to figure out a way to accept the truth propositional claims. Like Gerard is saying, maybe there is something else going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And I that opened that up a lot, but I was still intensely skeptical, right? Because I had read critical scholarship of the New Testament, and I thought, at the end of the day, this still isn't true, right? Like, sociologically useful, check. Doing something that I had not previously thought of that is good, check. True, no. Uh, and so what happened then is my technical specialty is counterforensics. So computer forensics is when you analyze computer artifacts to
Right.
reconstruct historical timelines.
Oh,
Counterforensics
is to
is
make sure
when
that can't be done.
yes, and to make sure people come to incorrect conclusions or can't draw
Oh,
conclusions. And I did a lot of malware development and things like that was utilizing counterforensic techniques. I became an expert at counterforensics. But what counterforensics really is it's not messing up forensics. It is deeply understanding historical reconstructive methodology. It is a deep analysis of how do you know things
huh.
in historical reconstruction.
Yeah.
How can you know things?
Yeah.
And what processes do you follow to accurately reconstruct the past? Because in order to mess up the forensic process, you need to understand how it works. And you need to understand how it works at every single point in time. And to understand it at every single point in time, you need to basically develop a very strong understanding of like methodological epistemology and things like that. And just like digging down into, okay, if this artifact exists or if this string of artifacts exist, how do I analyze this to reconstruct an event that has already happened? To know that this event did happen.
Right.
And
And not another
so
series of events that would have
yes,
led to the artifact. Yep. Get it.
yes. And so that is my specialty. And I was doing a lot of work specifically on what is called attribution denial. So attribution is when you take a whole bunch of artifacts and you say, who created these? Who was responsible for making this? Or you see a message that someone wrote and you say, okay, who actually wrote that? Was that the guy who said that they wrote that? And this is an extremely complex field. This is incredibly difficult. Like, these are billion-dollar industries that exist to like do attribution and threat intelligence and all this stuff. This is an incredibly important function to the military to be able to do, and really important for military intelligence and civilian intelligence to figure out how to attribute things. And I had never really connected this to New Testament Bible scholarship until I was talking to a friend, and my friend said something to the effect of, like, obviously, Paul didn't write this. And when he said Paul didn't write this, it like triggered a sleeper cell programming in me where I was like, wait a second, you just made an attribution claim. And I have been like unpicking the attribution process so that I can mess it up and so that I can make you falsely attribute something. I've been trying to think of how you would do this very deeply. And I know the New Testament. I know it academically. I know what data you're working with. I know what texts you're working with. I know what manuscripts you're working with to make these conclusions.
Yeah.
And I basically said, there is no way any responsible forensic analyst would come to a strong attribution claim about anything written in the New Testament. So, did Paul write this? Did Paul not write this? The only responsible thing to do methodologically is to say we don't know who wrote this, because the type of information that you would need to prove someone did or did not write that is simply not contained within the evidence that we have. And that is a good, that's a normal thing to conclude, by the way. Like, that is an incredibly benign thing that I do all the time in my day-to-day work, is just say,
Sure.
we don't have the evidence to be able to tell you exactly what happened here, because the type of evidence that we would need no longer exists.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And so I was super comfortable making those assertions, and I had just never thought about how my work of figuring out what happened 2 weeks ago, or trying to stop people from figuring out what happened 2 weeks ago, applied to things that happened 2,000 years ago. And I started to sort of reevaluate critical scholarship and reevaluate the hard claims of critical scholarship in light of me doing forensic reconstruction. And that is a thing that really, I think, broke down the last barrier for me, was sort of realizing that, like, okay, when Bart Ehrman says Jesus didn't say that, do we know that? How do we know that? Like, when apologists say, no, Jesus definitely said this, do we know that? No, we don't. We have a collection of manuscripts. That's what we have, essentially.
Yep.
We don't know who wrote them. We don't know where they came from. We don't know any of this data that I would need to make attribution. Like, one of the basic things, they'll look through Paul's letters and they'll say, look, the stylometric differences and the stylometric qualities between these letters differ so significantly.
Right.
I do stylometric analysis. I write stylometric analysis algorithms. Like, I have worked with this stuff. That's not how any of this works. In order for stylometric analysis to be significant, you need to know the time between which the letters were sent. You need to know where they were sent from. You need to know all these other things for stylometrics to matter, right? Because just think about it. Think about how you wrote emails 5 years ago.
Yep.
Is that the same voice you use today? Maybe. Also, maybe not.
Depends on who I'm writing to. Depends on what I'm writing about. No,
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Depends how much sleep you've had.
Yep.
Depends on how much stress you're under.
Yep.
Depends on your power relationship to the other person.
Yep.
Are you asking for something from them, or are you trying to tell them you need to do this because I have this authority over you? Vastly changes the way you write. Now, stylometric differences are significant in some cases. And, like, especially, you also just need to look at volume. How much writing do you have? And is that volume base sufficient to develop stylometric patterns that can rule out authorship? And the New Testament is like 30,000 words. That is not enough.
It's not very big.
Like, that, it is small, relatively speaking, to the types of data and the volume of data that you typically need to show these things. And I just started realizing, oh, like, I had a unwarrantedly high certainty placed on the conclusions of critical historical reconstruction of the Bible. And, like, I want to be very clear. I don't think the apologists do a better job at this. I think they do a worse job, just methodologically speaking. I think your standard, like, minimal facts approach is worse than the counter apologists approach, or even the maximal facts or whatever. I don't think those are good methodologies, but I also don't think that the critical scholars have particularly good methodologies. I think the New Testament and the Old Testament, even more so, are what we call degraded information environments. So they're environments in which the types of things that we would typically need to establish in order to know something simply aren't there. And that's actually a fairly common case. And so then you deal with, well, how do you make a decision in an information degraded environment? That's something I'm good at. That's something I've been trained to do. That's something that you do a lot in like intelligence doesn't do that. The people getting the intelligence reports do that, but
Yeah.
when you're involved in those processes, it's like, oh, I had been thinking about this the wrong way, and I had sort of taken these ideas on face value without critically examining. Like, I had not been skeptical of the skepticism as much as I should have been. And once I sort of realized that, I thought, okay, well, what am I supposed to do now? Like, what am I supposed to do with this information? And I found myself with a very strong desire to become a Christian again.
Hmm.
And I thought, how am I going to do this? How does this make sense? Does this even make sense? And I read two things. So the first thing I read was a book called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, by Tadeusz Borowski. He's not a Christian. He's a socialist who was a political prisoner at Auschwitz during the Second World War. So he was at Auschwitz as a laborer because he was involved in the Polish underground universities. So he was arrested, thrown into prison, and then after he came out of Auschwitz at the end of the war, he was liberated from the camp. He wrote a book about his time at the camp called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. And in it, there is an essay called Auschwitz, Our Home. And in Auschwitz, Our Home, he has this very long diatribe where he goes into explaining how he used to idolize antiquity and he used to think about antiquity with such high regard. But now, as he is a slave in the concentration camps, he no longer identifies with Plato. He no longer identifies with the grand philosophers of antiquity. He identifies with the slaves who they destroyed to build their grand monuments.
Yes.
And he has this line, Antiquity, the tremendous concentration camp, where the slave was branded on his forehead by his master for trying to, and crucified for trying to escape. Antiquity, the conspiracy of free men against slaves. And he thinks about Rome and thinks about ancient Greece in a way where I just think, oh, he's right. Like, he's absolutely correct
Yeah.
about his
Yeah.
orientation to this. And I started realizing this critique sounds very familiar. Why does it sound familiar? He's obviously right about this, but why am I like getting that feeling that I've been here before? And I started realizing, oh, this was like a critique of ancient Rome by a lot of Christians
Yep.
in the early stages of Christianity. Like,
Yep.
not like in the first 300 years. And even after that, a lot of them still said a lot of the same things. And I started realizing, oh no, they're like completely right about that. And I started reframing a lot of, because I had read a lot of early Christian texts, but hadn't really conceptualized them in that way before. And then I started rethinking of what if they were also doing what Tadeusz Borowski is saying, like when Gregory of Nyssa is railing against people, or when like Basil of Caesarea is doing the same thing, and like on social justice by Saint Basil, he's he's essentially lobbying the same critiques, but he's doing it through God.
Yep.
and
Yep.
and I was like, wow, I really need to rethink this, because I just think these people are right at some fundamental level. But the last brick to fall was reading Simone Weil.
Hmm.
So my podcast artwork is Simone Weil. I think she is. So I'm very skeptical of retroactive diagnosis. I look back when people look back and say this person was definitely autistic throughout history. I'm very skeptical of that process. Mostly because we typically don't have the types of information that we could use to make that. Like, we don't have detailed autobiographical data. We don't have their journals, or if we do have their journals, they're not in the same way that we expect them to be. But Simone Weil, like, we had people up until recently who were alive and knew her.
Hmm.
And lots of descriptions of her behavior, lots of descriptions of her in herself in her own writing. And I started reading her and I just started resonating with her in a way that I hadn't previously resonated with any Christian author.
Hmm.
And I started thinking, this is weird. I read an autobiography about her and I thought, oh, this woman was definitely on the autism spectrum based on what I'm reading. And then I met a Simone Weil scholar named Brad Jerzak,
Yeah.
and I talked to him about it. And I said, hey, what's up with this? And he said, yeah, Simone Weil was probably autistic. Like, I have no doubt in my mind. And he had worked with a lot of people with disabilities in his church, like cognitive disabilities and things like that. And as a scholar, he said, yeah, I immediately identified her as being on the autism spectrum. And I thought, oh, that's why she resonates with me so much. And reading her stuff, like, I obviously don't agree with everything in it, but it was a way of understanding and explaining Christianity that no one had explained it to me before, and a way of conceptualizing and thinking about Christianity that made sense to my autistic brain. And I think what I needed is basically just another autistic person who
Hmm.
understood things in the way that I understood things to explain things to me. And so I read Simone Weil and I thought, I am a Christian now. And so then I was like, well, where do I go to church? And I was already attending the Anglican church for fun. So I thought, might as well stick with it. And I really liked liturgy, like autistic people. One of the main sort of facets of my research that I found is Christianity, or autistic Christians have this tendency that I call high church migration, where as you get older and you're autistic, you tend to the chances that you will go end up in a high church, or maybe not a high church, but a very structured liturgical church, increases as you age. And so I was already drawn to Anglicanism, and then I'm in Canada, so I was in the Anglican Church of Canada, which so I spent a lot of time church hopping, trying to find a church that was, theologically more aligned with what I had become, which was a, fairly theologically conservative,
Hmm.
as most autistic Christians are. I found an Anglo-Catholic parish in my diocese that was, in Canada particularly, one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about and yelling about is MAID, and how MAID expansion
Yeah.
particularly affects autistic people,
Yeah.
and
I
how
believe it.
it's not a good thing.
No.
The Anglican Church of Canada's response to it has been extremely disappointing, to say the least.
Mm. Mm.
And this Anglo-Catholic Church, the first homily that I ever heard from it was the priest talking about what a tragedy MAID was and why
Mm.
it's bad. And I thought, okay, I could be here. This will be fine. And so yeah, so now I go to a more theologically conservative Anglican Anglo-Catholic church, and
Wow.
I've been there for a few years. And so yeah, that's sort of condensed version of my
Wow.
coming back.
That's really cool. That was super helpful. That was that was really helpful. I mean, I'm sure you've told it. I mean, you had a podcast, so you told the story before, but
Yeah,
it was very well laid out. And
yeah, and like it. So I've spent a lot of time looking at autistic reconverts, and a lot of us have very similar trajectories when we
mm,
reconvert.
yes,
We almost never reconvert because we are convinced by the arguments. It's almost never what you
yeah,
see. Even when you look at people who are convinced by the arguments and the sort of like systematic approach to proving Christianity or proving God, tends to be a lot of young autistics, like young men in
yeah,
particular.
yeah.
But outside of that, the conversion narratives, and especially reconversion narratives, tend to be closer to mine, where they're sort of like not direct and have more to do with a desire to be part of Christianity than a compulsion to think that I can prove this to be true.
Yep.
Um, anyway, and it is one of the many reasons I get frustrated with apologetics, but that's a topic for another time, I think.
Well, and I can see why. I mean, for me, I like playing with arguments. Arguments are fun. I
Yeah,
enjoy watching
I have
people.
nothing against arguments.
I enjoy watching a
It's
debate,
cool.
but in my experience, that's not usually
Yeah,
why people do what they do.
yeah,
Again, it's not unimportant. It's not that it doesn't factor in for people, but it's not the sort of syllogistic, mechanistic, gears working that puts someone over an edge or makes someone go. And so I can really understand why you found in this little corner um, a bunch of people, because that's every community will have, to one degree or not, its little even implicit orthodoxies and um, elements, and that certainly is an element for me, and it's certainly an element of the corner. Most of us sort of prioritize the relationality, but also a pragmatism and
yeah,
a degree of comfort with understanding that you're just not going that perspective on the world isn't going to get you what you're looking for. I understand that
yeah,
you're like, well, if the world should look like I think it should work in my head, and it just doesn't. And at some point, you're just going to have to make your peace with this and say, okay, how should I live now? So, well,
yeah. And
go
I've
ahead.
I've also found that a lot of autistic Christians, so I've been observing them coming in and then leaving your
Yes.
spaces, and I see a lot of them coming in and trying to interact and really trying very hard and then getting
Yeah.
very frustrated because they're looking for those hard answers,
Yeah.
right? And they're
Yeah.
looking for those exact things and
Yeah.
they get frustrated and so they leave because they're not getting that,
Yeah.
right?
No.
And they're getting a lot of it's complicated, or
Yeah.
the way that things are being explained are not ways that they're intuitively grasping.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I definitely see a lot coming into this little corner of the internet, but also it's just very interesting to see when people like you clash with a very clearly young autistic man who's incredibly systematic. You know, many
Yeah.
cases, as I'm sure you were very aware because you're the ones talking to them. um, but yeah, I see it a lot, and a lot of them end up coming to me as well, and I have to have very long conversations about how you need to use systematic thinking to undermine your systematic thinking. Like, it is only through hyper systematizing that you can come to the conclusion that hyper systematizing doesn't work. And I often have to walk them through these processes, and
Wow.
like get them thinking about what things mean and how do we know things a lot. Ideal, yeah. I've met quite a few autistic people in your community who are like, they're just not saying what I need to hear, or like, I don't get it. I don't understand what's going on. And I often have to explain to them what's going on and spend a lot of time walking them through. And they're typically young men.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, no, I see a lot of that. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've spent most of our time, and you've been gracious enough to sort of, which is the pattern here, to sort of share your story. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to ask me or anything else you wanted to do. Um,
Um, yeah, I don't know. Do you have any specific questions about autism in your community that you're interested in? Because
well,
I
I
mean,
see it
I'm always
too.
looking to hear what other people think
Yeah.
and what other people want to know.
What you just described about the frustration that people have. Yep, I totally get it. And they come and they get really frustrated because it's like, no, don't you see? It's like,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
And I also know that I don't really have a key for your lock that's going to do something. I mean, time is an integral part of this because
Yes.
I was just talking to Benjamin Boyce, who something's going to come out on his channel. And, he asked me, to what degree does your Calvinism play into it? And it's like, a lot of people, let's say, I think generally on the spectrum, they find Calvinism and they find a system that certain subcommunities of Calvinism have been working on this system forever, and
Yeah.
Calvinists loved systematic theology and loved all of the answers to all of the questions, and they'd have all of this, and then they hear that I'm a Calvinist and like, he's a Calvinist. I'm going to go talk to him, and then they start going and they realize this wasn't the Calvinist I was looking
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
And part of that, what I was explaining to Benjamin was, I mean, actually, it's a part of my Calvinism that there's a degree of humility with respect to the expectations that I have to deliver to people what it is they think they need or are looking for, one way or the other. That many, many people just simply need to go through a process. And as your story nicely illustrated, you can't lay out your process as an algorithm. And well, first you have to join the Mennonite Brethren.
Yeah.
Then you have to be raised in my home. Then you have to have the
Yeah.
same parents that I do. I mean, the number of variables there, they just boom, they just explode.
Yeah.
And then you've got to join the Canadian military and get into this kind of an, I mean, no,
Yeah.
no. And once if they sit down and they start thinking about this, say, no, I can't go back and live his life.
Yeah.
You have to live your life. And you have a whole separate set of variables, and you're not necessarily going to come to the same answers or walk the same paths as John. And and so that's for me part of why, to the degree that I have had the privilege of forming and shaping the corner, it is more about patience and friendship to say, you can come in here and get frustrated and say, VanderKlay is a waste of time and slam the door and walk away. And 3 years later, if you send me a DM on Twitter or you send me an email, I'll talk to you again. I'm not
Yeah.
upset by the fact that you slammed the door on me because I understand that for many people, part of the process involves doors slamming
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. And
and leaving one group to go to another group. I get it. I get it. And maybe I won't be the helpful person for you. Maybe Simone Weil will. Maybe someone else will. I don't know who that could be because I am not God. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pray for you and I'm going to trust God and His Spirit that God knows and I don't. And there we go. So that tends to be how I operate.
yeah, and I mean that's very similar to how I operate. I often tell people like you will come to me looking for answers and I do not have them. Much to the frustration of many Calvinists, I describe myself as a postmodern Calvinist in my orientation. Um,
Oh, that'll provoke some comments.
yes, yeah, they find it. I mostly say it because I think it's funny to say. But yeah, so I have a very similar way of thinking about things, and like yeah, it happens a lot. I mean
Well,
I've been doing this for 10ish years and
oh,
talking to people on and
longer
off
than I
for
have,
yeah
at least with
and
this space on the
and
internet.
with this specific sub community we have many quirks of many different
Yeah.
types. i
Well,
i often find though like one thing a lot of them need is for just someone who just operates on the same brainwave length as them to say, okay, let me translate this for you, let me explain to you what they're actually trying to say, and then you can evaluate that. And like I spend a lot of time, especially with young men, sitting them down and saying, let's just learn how to think. Let's
yeah,
learn how to analyze claims. Let's learn how to like properly apportion our ideas to the evidence and properly evaluate evidence and what it is, and properly gauge our expectations for truth and expectations for certainty. Like a really big problem I see with a lot of these young men is they're looking for exact answers.
yes,
And it's like, where else in life do you get exact answers?
yes,
Like math, pure math?
yeah.
and where else?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
never. It's
Yeah.
always messy. It's always kludgy. There's always things that are going to get stuck. You can't ask questions about the real world and expect yourself to not come out with a sort of confusing level of complexity. That isn't to say you can't figure things out. I think you can, but you can sort of get to approximations and systems and models of understanding, but those models are never going to be fully accurate. Some are going to be a lot more accurate than others, and some are going to be a lot worse than others. And your job is to basically evaluate these models and evaluate these things by learning how to think critically. And like the, and also just a really big thing I do is like teaching autistic people how to be comfortable with uncertainty, how to be comfortable not knowing,
Yep.
and how to be comfortable making decisions when you don't know things.
Yep.
And like I used to train young officers in the military, and like junior officers when they just come in, one of the biggest things that they deal with is decision paralysis in difficult situations where you throw all these things at them. They're like, if I could just figure it out, and it's like, no, you can't figure it out, and you're never going to figure it out, and no amount of staring at your topographical maps and your data is going to fix this. You sort of just need to make a decision right now.
Yeah.
So make a decision, and here's how you train yourself to do that. And yeah, so I deal a lot with that. I can
Yep.
relate in many ways.
Yep.
Uh, yeah.
No, I totally get it. I very much see it. I very much see it. I very much
Yep.
see it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
No.
it's, for parents who aren't necessarily on the spectrum, but they have kids on the spectrum, or their kids are,
Yeah.
and as a part of this is also the fact that, I mean, we have this bucket that we call autism, and even if you portion it into one, two, and three,
Yeah. Even within
still
one, there are so many variations.
right,
Like
and you have
I classify them, and I have like 18 different subtypes that I use for my just within Christianity, just to
yeah.
explain the different types of thinking within Christianity. There's like 18 subtypes.
So
Yeah,
you've done a podcast, you've had three
yeah.
runs at a book, but thought, and I can totally understand that thought. Nah. So do you have a website where you put all this stuff out there, or
Um, I mean, I just put it out on YouTube and Podbean, and
okay.
then that federates out to all the other podcasting places where you can find it. It's just called Christianity on the Spectrum. I have a Twitter that you can follow to hear many of my thoughts and me commenting on autism disinformation that is rife on the internet. Um,
You
the
mean there's disinformation on the internet? Please
there
tell me it
is
isn't so.
there is disinformation on all sides of the political aisle when it comes to autism. You have progressive autism disinformation and conservative autism disinformation and apolitical autism disinformation. Yes. So I tweet a lot about autism and Christianity and stuff related to that. Also on Blue Sky, not as active on that. So yeah,
I know
Twitter.
people. What are your thoughts on Blue Sky? I see every now and then somebody will send me a link on it, but it just seems like
Yeah.
Twitter for
Um,
people who got annoyed with Twitter.
yeah. I think so. This is my hot take. I think Blue Sky, in order for a social media platform to be healthy, um, you need predators, like you need people who attack and people who
Oh,
hunt other people and people who like engagement bait
yeah,
and stir the pot
yeah,
and say controversial things.
yeah.
And a lot of Blue Sky doesn't have that natural antagonism and
Right,
that inherent meanness to it that
right,
Twitter needs to function. And
right.
so one of the things that makes Twitter fun for a lot of people is dunking on everyone.
Yeah.
And Blue Sky, that doesn't really happen that much, or like
Uh,
arguing with people,
yeah.
or arguing about various things. Where in like on Blue Sky, it just, I mean, one of the comments I made is one of the reasons I'm less active on Blue Sky is I have fewer people that I can argue with, because most of my Twitter interactions are someone says something that is incorrect about autism, and I say, no, you're wrong. Like autistic people are not magical wizards who have superpowers. We are people who have many flaws and many issues, and you should stop this right now. But saying that same thing on Blue Sky gets a lot of people upset that you've said something that could
You've
potentially be
said
taken as offensive.
no. You've said you're
Yes,
wrong. How dare you say you're wrong to someone?
yes, and on Twitter, people still get mad at me, but it's less. It's in a different way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think I primarily am on Twitter mostly because I just find Blue Sky less engaging and more restrictive in
Yeah.
what you can and can't say. But yeah,
Yeah, the walled garden. I get it.
yeah,
Well, John, this has been a lot of fun. It's been very enlightening, and I'm probably going to look at a few people in the corner with some fresh eyes because I'm not going to name names, but and some people are going to be like, is he thinking about me?
yeah.
Um, I'm
He
not going to
is.
name
Yeah,
names, but it's because for me the challenge is I want to facilitate, I want to help.
yeah,
Um, and I'm pretty flexible in terms of pathways and processes. And so no, this has been super helpful. I really appreciate it.
yeah. If you or any of your listeners want a good resource for learning how these people think or why, my podcast.
I'll put the link, I'll put the
Yeah,
link below.
yeah. It's I've gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of people being like, "Thank you for explaining this so well." So
Yeah.
I know it works.
Well, you do explain
But
well.
yeah,
You explain very well. I'm very impressed.
yeah.
You really it's not a thing. It's not an easy thing to
It is
sort
not a
of
skill
go
that came innately
through
to
in a
me.
systematic, intelligible way. Just kind of walk someone through, and you did it. You did it very, very well. So very impressed. All right.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you,
Thanks.
John. Take
See
care.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.